Welcome to the program.
Thank you, David.
The debt crisis in Europe, what is it about and is it affecting the United States?
It's a serious crisis, as serious as Europe has had since World War II and the Great Depression, and it is affecting the United States, and that's basically because of the very close economic links between Europe and the United States. To illustrate, when the crisis first hit here in the United States, particularly with the collapse of the speculations and the new instruments, the credit default swaps, the asset-backed securities, all of that, Europeans were affected because European banks were major investors in the American speculative boom that built up to the crisis, and so they collapsed just the way American major banks did. And just like here in the United States, in Europe, the banks, having now no capacity to repay their investors or even to refund the money of the deposit, they had invested it all in speculative instruments that collapsed, turned to their governments. The same banker who had been giving speeches for years about the joys of the free market and the need of keeping the government out of the economy ran, each one faster than the other, for government help, for government bailouts. So the governments of Europe, from the big ones like France and Germany to the little poor ones like Portugal and Greece, borrowed money like crazy to raise the cash to bail out the banks. Basically, what they did in Europe is what they've done here. The government made good the bad investments of the private sector by taking on massive new debt itself. The debt crisis of governments is a direct consequence, A, of the economic crisis brought on by private capitalism on a global scale, and B, by the ability of those banks caught up in that crisis to get the government to borrow the money to bail them out. So now we come to the next step in this absurd story. The governments are now in trouble. They borrowed like crazy. They spent the money to recoup the banks. And now the question is, my goodness, the government is deeply in debt, and it's now facing the problem that if you borrow like crazy, you have to pay interest to all the people you borrowed from. Who do governments borrow from? Banks, insurance companies, large corporations, wealthy individuals, and in some cases, other countries. If there are other countries rich enough to lend to you, you get loans from them. The country in the world that's most rich these days to lend is the People's Republic of China. So you have this spectacle that global capitalism in Europe and America can't function without loans from the world's number one communist country, something that you might want to think about in terms of its historic implications. But in Europe, here's the problem. European governments now have to pay huge interest payments for all that borrowing they did to bail out their financial sectors. And they realize that in order to pay that interest, they're going to have to go to the mass of their people and do one of two things. Either raise taxes to get the money to pay the interest charges, or else cut social programs, cut public employment to free up money that used to provide those programs and use it instead to pay off the banks, insurance companies, large corporations, foreign governments, rich people who are the creditors of modern uh, countries in Europe. And either of those two options is political suicide for whatever government or political party is in power. To go to your people in the middle of a crisis and say, sorry, but I'm now going to have to tax you, or give you less social programs in a crisis when you need them more, that's not going to make you politically popular. So what are you going to do? You can't do nothing because here's the risk. If you don't do something, the very banks you bailed out will say to you, we're not going to lend you any more money because we're not sure you have the political muscle to make your people pay us off the interest we're owed. It creates the following absurd comment on our situation. The banks that only exist because they were bailed out by the government are turning to the government and saying, we're not going to lend you back what? The money you gave us, and you're not going to be able to continue unless you stick it to your people in a tax increase or social program decrease, which is called in Europe austerity. So there we are in Europe. a kind of a impasse. The creditors, rich people, banks, insurance companies, large corporations, are saying you must cut back, you governments, to free up the money to pay the interest you owe us. And the mass of people in the streets saying we're not going to pay taxes to a government which doesn't use it to provide us with the services we need, but instead gives it to the creditors who are the ones you used our money to bail out. This is a fundamental clash. It is not going to go away. The collapse of the Papandreou government in Greece changes nothing. The collapse of the Berlusconi government in Italy changes nothing, because these are just musical chairs at the top. They don't deal with the impasse. Which way are you going to go? Are you going to service the financial sector by imposing austerity on the mass of people? Or are you going to deal with the fact that you mishandled the crisis, that you bailed out entities which are now not only saying thank you, but are actually trying to get you to stick it to the very people upon whom they relied to come out of the crisis they caused? This is a fundamental conflict which is going to be played out in Europe. It may destroy the European Union. It may end the experiment called the euro. If so, it will be devastating for much of Europe, and the ramifications of that will impact on the United States in profound ways, worsening the crisis here, raising unemployment, and disorganizing the global capitalist system as it continues to crumble.